Hey guys, tonight we're tackling a question that should genuinely disturb you. How does an entire profession, educated, credentialed, well-intentioned, become systematically catastrophic? Not through incompetence, through confidence. Medieval plague doctors had a case study. They had university degrees. They had studied the ancients. They had medical authority. And they killed more people than they saved. Not by accident, by design, by system. Here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. These doctors didn't think they were wrong. They knew they were right. Their theories were logically consistent. Their treatments followed directly from their understanding. Their failures were always explainable. The patient was too sick. The corruption was too advanced. God's will. Never did the system allow them to question whether bloodletting itself was a problem. And that's not an accident. That's how the system was built. Tonight we're asking, why? Why could educated people be so completely, systematically wrong? Why couldn't they see what we can see instantly from our perspective? That you're literally bleeding people to death while they're already dying of plague. And more importantly, what does this tell us about how any system of authority, including modern ones, can become locked into catastrophic wrongness and become unable to recognize it? So before you get comfortable, like the video, subscribe if this hits you. Drop a comment about a moment when you realize an authority figure was completely wrong about something they were supposed to know. It happens more than we want to admit. Dim the lights. This isn't comfortable history. It's a story about confidence, institutions, and the mechanisms that let entire professions become architects of suffering without anyone realizing it happening. Now, let's talk about the theoretical foundation that enabled medieval medicine's catastrophe. And here's the crucial question. How do you build an entire medical system that's wrong in every possible way, yet have educated people defend it as truth? The answer is, you start with a framework so elegant, so logically consistent, that it explains everything. Humoral theory. This wasn't just a guess. This wasn't folk wisdom. This was a reigning scientific theory of the Mediterranean world, inherited from Galen, refined by Hippocrates, taught in universities for over 1,000 years, and it made perfect sense, which is exactly why it was so catastrophically dangerous. Here's the problem we need to confront. A theory that explains everything, literally everything, including its own failures, cannot be disproven from within. And medieval medicine wasn't designed to learn from evidence. It was designed to interpret evidence through a pre-existing framework. That's not science. That's religion wearing a scientist's robe. So tonight's first question, how do systems of authority prevent people from seeing obvious truth? How does confidence plus institutional backing create an epistemic prison? And what can medieval medicine teach us about why smart people working within a system can become catastrophically wrong without realizing it? Let's start with a thought experiment. You're a medieval physician. You've spent 7 years in university. You've memorized Galen's texts. You understand the theory perfectly. The human body contains 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Disease happens when these fall out of balance. The solution is obvious. Restore balance. Simple, elegant, logical. Now, you see evidence that contradicts this. You bleed a patient. They get worse. You see this repeatedly. What do you conclude? Modern thinking. The treatment doesn't work. Maybe the theory is wrong. Medieval thinking. The patient was already too far gone. Or my bloodletting timing was off. Or the patient's constitution was weak. Or, here's the key, God intervened. Do you see what just happened? The system explained the failure, using the system itself. The theory wasn't falsifiable. It couldn't lose. This is called an epistemic closure, a system of belief that's sealed against external evidence. It's not that medieval physicians weren't smart enough to see the contradiction. It's that the framework prevented contradiction from even registering as contradiction. It reframed contradiction as confirmation. Let's look at how this works specifically. Historical records from the University of Montpellier show that physicians kept detailed patient records. They documented who they bled, who recovered, who died. Now here's the crucial part. They had the data. They could have analyzed it. They could have said, interesting, the patients who recovered seem to have recovered at similar rates regardless of whether we bled them. But they didn't. Why? Because a framework told them bloodletting worked. So when they reviewed the data, they selectively remembered the successes and rationalized the failures. This is confirmation bias, but not the innocent cognitive error we often think of. This was institutional confirmation bias, baked into the medical education system, enforced by professional licensing, protected by university authority. Here's what makes this nightmarish. The system worked perfectly from inside the system. Evidence was collected. Interpretations were made. The framework was protected. Learning was prevented. And nobody realized learning was being prevented. Here's a critical insight. Medieval medicine didn't fail because it lacked evidence. It failed because it lacked a mechanism to update in response to evidence. And this is the deepest issue we need to understand. Imagine you're a physician in 1348. The plague has arrived. You've been trained that disease is humoral imbalance. A patient comes to you with fever and swollen lymph nodes. Your training tells you exactly what to do. Restore humoral balance through bloodletting. You perform the bloodletting. The patient is now weaker, having lost blood. His immune system is now compromised from blood loss. He's also dehydrated. His body is less capable of fighting off the infection. Any reasonable observer would say, this bloodletting made him worse. But here's what you see instead. You see a patient with a serious condition. You applied the appropriate treatment. Whatever happens next is in God's hands, or the patient's constitution, or the severity of the disease. Your treatment was correct. The outcome was uncertain. This is how physicians rationalize failure. Let's trace what happened to a specific patient through the medieval medical lens. Day 1, patient arrives with plague. Fever, buboes. Physician diagnoses, severe humoral imbalance, especially hot and dry humors. Treatment, bloodletting purging theriac, a complex medicine containing opium and various herbs. Day 2, patient's fever worsens. Patient is weaker. Physician's interpretation, the treatment is working. The corruption is being driven out, causing temporary worsening. This is called crisis. The body's crisis point where treatment causes temporary escalation before recovery. More bloodletting is applied. Day 3. Patient shows signs of sepsis, the body's inflammatory response to severe infection. Patient is delirious. Physician's interpretation. The humors are severely disordered. More extreme measures needed. Additional bloodletting. Mercury inhalation. The patient's own urine is prescribed as medicine. Day 4. Patient is near death. Nearly all blood volume is compromised by infection or blood loss. Physician's interpretation. The disease is too advanced. No reasonable treatment could save him. Day 5. Patient dies. Physician's conclusion. A tragic case. The corruption was too advanced. The patient's constitution was weak. I applied the appropriate treatments. The outcome was beyond my control. Now here's the question that should bother you. At what point could this physician have realized he was wrong? When would the evidence have been undeniable? The answer is never, because the system explained every outcome. Every failure could be rationalized. Every success confirmed the system. The theory was unfalsifiable. This is what separates medieval medicine from actual science. Science says, here's a hypothesis. We'll test it. If the evidence contradicts it, we revise it. Medieval medicine said, here's the truth. All observations will be interpreted through this framework. Contradictory evidence is an illusion caused by factors we can list. But, and this is crucial, physicians didn't see themselves as closed-minded. They saw themselves as careful observers interpreting evidence through the lens of correct theory. They kept detailed records. They discussed cases with colleagues. They refined their techniques. They optimized within the framework. from inside the system. It looked like good medical practice. This is the architecture of institutional wrongness. It doesn't look wrong from inside. It looks meticulous, careful, sophisticated, thoughtful. Let's get specific about the confirmation bias mechanism. A medieval physician in 1350 would treat perhaps 100 patients per year. Of those 100 patients with serious conditions, historically, without treatment, about 50 to 70% would die. With medieval treatment, mortality was probably higher due to harm, but physicians didn't perceive it that way. Let's say 40 patients recover, 60 die. The physician's memory doesn't record 40 recovered despite my treatment, and 60 died because of my treatment. Instead, it records, I successfully treated 40 cases. 60 cases were too advanced for treatment. The mind selectively reinforces successful cases and rationalizes failures. This is how Guy de Chauliac, one of the most famous medieval surgeons, whose work was taught in medical schools for centuries, could document patient after patient dying after his treatments, yet conclude that his methods were correct. His own case notes showed deaths from infections caused by not closing wounds, which he deliberately avoided per medical theory. Yet his conclusion was that infection indicated disease severity, not treatment failure. The question becomes, how could a system this obviously wrong persist for centuries? The answer has multiple layers. Layer 1. Institutional authority medical licensing required knowledge of the humoral framework. If you practiced differently, you were unlicensed and therefore illegitimate. This created a professional incentive to conform. Your income, your reputation, your ability to practice, all depended on conforming to institutional standards. Layer 2. Economic incentive physicians made money from medical practice. A physician who questioned the framework risked his income and reputation. Conformity was economically rewarded. Complex, expensive treatments, mercury, theriac, made more money than simple remedies. Layer 3. Psychological comfort abandoning the framework meant admitting that your education was built on falsehood, that you'd spent years learning something worthless, that patients you treated might have suffered or died because of your treatments. This is psychologically difficult. Staying within the framework is psychologically safer. Layer 4. Conceptual vocabulary medieval physicians had no alternative vocabulary for thinking about disease. They couldn't think, maybe it's caused by invisible organisms, because the concept didn't exist. They couldn't compare their theory to alternatives, because no alternative framework was available. The system was total. It monopolized conceptual space. Layer 5. Selective observation. Humans see what they expect to see. A physician expecting bloodletting to work would notice and remember cases where it seemed to work. He would unconsciously filter his attention, his memory, his interpretation. This isn't dishonesty. This is how human perception works when filtered through expectations. Here's a concrete example. A patient with plague sometimes recovers spontaneously. About 20 to 30% of untreated plague patients survive due to their immune system fighting off the infection. Now imagine a physician bleeds this patient and the patient recovers. The physician concludes the bloodletting worked. He doesn't think the bloodletting did nothing and the patient's immune system recovered anyway. Why? Because the framework tells him that bloodletting works. So he interprets the outcome through that lens. This is confirmation bias at an institutional level. The entire medical establishment was built to selectively notice confirming evidence and rationalize away contradictions. It wasn't a deliberate conspiracy. It was structural. Let's examine the mechanism that prevented medieval medicine from self-correcting. This is important because it's not unique to medieval medicine. It's how any system prevents learning when authority becomes more important than evidence. A medieval physician would occasionally notice something odd. Maybe he'd see a pattern. Patients who avoided treatment seemed to survive plague at rates similar to patients he treated. This is actually what the evidence showed. By the way, wealthy people who could afford physicians had higher mortality rates during plague than poorer people who couldn't. So our physician might think, Interesting. The treatments don't seem to help. What happens next? He could A. Question the entire framework. B. Rationalize the observation. Option A requires him to admit that his education was wrong, that he's been harming people, that he needs to fundamentally reconsider how medicine works. This is terrifying. Psychologically, humans resist this kind of cognitive restructuring. It threatens identity, status, and self-image. Option B is easy. Those patients without treatment had better constitutions, or they were younger, or God favored them. The treatments are still correct. The observation is accommodated within the existing framework without changing the framework. Guess which option physicians chose? The framework had a built-in explanation for every possible observation. Better outcomes without treatment? Those people had better constitutions. Worse outcomes with treatment? The disease was too advanced. Equal outcomes either way? The treatment was applied incorrectly. This is what makes a system epistemically closed. It's not just that it resists evidence. It's that it incorporates evidence in a way that always confirms itself. Every observation becomes support for the system. The framework becomes unfalsifiable. Think about how different this is from how modern science is supposed to work. If a modern treatment has a 50% success rate and a placebo has a 40% success rate, we notice the difference. We acknowledge it. We might still use the treatment, but we're looking for contradictions between theory and evidence. Medieval medicine did the opposite. It was looking for confirmations. Every observation was filtered through the framework until it confirmed the framework. When contradictions appeared, they were reframed as misunderstandings, not as evidence against the theory. Here's what we need to understand. Medieval medicine didn't fail because physicians were stupid. It failed because the system was architecturally designed to prevent learning from experience. A good learning system looks like this. 1. Propose a theory. 2. Test it against reality. 3. Notice contradictions. 4. Revise the theory. 5. Repeat. Medieval medicine looked like this. 1. Inherit a theory from authority. 2. Test it against reality, but interpret reality through the theory. 3. Notice apparent contradictions, but rationalize them. 4. Refine technique within the theory, but never question the theory itself. 5. Repeat the rationalization. This is the difference between learning and optimization. Medieval medicine optimized. Physicians got better at bloodletting technique, found better bloodletting schedules, figured out better poultices. But they never learned that bloodletting itself was the problem. The consequence was centuries of stagnation. From roughly 1200 to 1600, medical practice barely changed. New medicines were added, techniques were refined, but the fundamental framework, humoral theory, bloodletting, magical thinking about disease, persisted unchanged. This isn't because nobody was smart enough to question it. It's because the institutional structure made questioning it prohibitively costly. Here's what happens when institutional authority becomes more important than evidence. Asterisk professional prestige depends on conformity. Asterisk the system's explanation of failures is built into the system itself. Asterisk alternative frameworks are unavailable or forbidden. Asterisk individual learning is blocked by institutional structure. Medieval medicine created a closed epistemic loop. Evidence was filtered through the theory. The theory incorporated the evidence. The system became unshakable. And the worst part? From inside the system, it looked like good science. Physicians were documenting observations, refining techniques, passing knowledge to students. The machinery of knowledge transmission was working perfectly. It was just transmitting the wrong knowledge with no mechanism to correct it. Underscore. So the theoretical framework was wrong. But here's where it gets worse. Because once you accept that disease is humoral imbalance, you don't just treat it with bloodletting. You also treat it with medicines. And if you're confident that you understand the underlying mechanism, you'll create medicines based on that understanding. which means you'll create medicines that are based on false premises. And if you're trying to treat something you don't understand using a framework that's completely backwards, the medicines you create might contain literally anything, including substances that are actively lethal. Let's talk about what medieval physicians were actually prescribing, because the pharmacology is where the confidence becomes outright horrifying. Underscore, 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 underscore. Now, here's where we need to ask, what happens when a wrong theory meets human creativity? When a physician is absolutely certain about the mechanism of disease, and he needs to create medicines to treat it, what does he create? The answer is, he creates medicines based on his wrong theory. Logical medicines. Medicines that make perfect sense within the framework. Medicines that are sometimes harmless, sometimes useless, and sometimes actively poisonous. This is the second layer of medieval medicine's catastrophe. The theoretical wrongness we discussed, that's one problem. But the practical implementation, the actual substances physicians gave people to consume, that's another level entirely. Here's the question that should bother you. If you're absolutely confident in a false premise, how harmful will your solutions be? More specifically, if you believe disease is caused by humoral imbalance, and you believe you can treat it by taking substances that balance humors, what substances would you give people? What would you consider reasonable medicine? The answer is almost anything that has strong properties. Anything that causes a visible reaction. Because visible reaction equals power, and power equals effectiveness. This is not how medicine works, but it's how confident systems think. Medieval physicians prescribed substances that range from harmless to horrifying, and they did so with complete confidence. Let's trace the logic. Here's the theoretical framework a medieval physician inherited. Disease is humoral imbalance. Different imbalances require different treatments. A patient with excess high humors needs cold treatments. A patient with excess dry humors needs moist treatments. Now, you need to create a medicine. What properties should it have? If the patient has excess high humors, you look for something cold. What's cold? Ice, snow, cold water. These are cold, so they should treat hot humors. Logical. If the patient has excess yellow bile, you look for something that targets bile. What targets bile? Well, bile is yellow and bitter. So something that's bitter might balance it. Something that's poisonous might work, because poison is powerful and has strong properties. This is the key insight. Medieval physicians associated strength and toxicity with medicinal power. Dangerous equals effective. This is why mercury became a standard treatment. Mercury is poisonous. Mercury is reactive. Mercury causes visible effects. Therefore, mercury must be powerful medicine. This logic is wrong, but it's internally consistent. Here's where institutional authority reinforces wrongness. Galen had mentioned mercury as a treatment. Medieval physicians inherited this. Universities taught it. Professional licensing required knowledge of mercury treatment. Physicians built entire careers around mercury use. To question mercury was to question Galen, the framework, and the entire structure of medical authority. The economic incentive reinforced this powerfully. A physician who prescribed only simple herbs was common, cheap, unimpressive. A physician who prescribed exotic medicines, mercury, theriac, unicorn horn, was expensive, prestigious, specialized. The patients who could afford him were wealthy. These were the people whose opinions mattered. They told other wealthy people that this physician was successful. Success, remember, was measured by outcomes that could be rationalized as supporting the theory. A wealthy person treated with mercury and theriac, who happened to recover, was living proof that the treatment worked. The physician didn't ask, would this person have recovered anyway? Would they have recovered faster without mercury poisoning? Let's list what medieval physicians actually gave people to consume. Not theoretically, actually, because understanding the specific substances helps us understand how confidence in wrongness generates terrible solutions. Mercury, the star treatment. Mercury was prescribed for plague, syphilis, wounds, and countless other conditions. Here's the mechanism from a medieval perspective. Mercury is powerful and reactive, therefore it must be powerful medicine. Here's the actual mechanism. Mercury is neurotoxic. At high doses, it causes death. At medium doses, it causes neurological damage and organ failure. At low doses, it causes chronic poisoning with tremors and psychological damage. A medieval physician treating plague would have his patient consume mercury compounds. Sometimes the patient would recover. The disease ran its course, or immune system won, despite mercury. The physician would credit mercury. Sometimes the patient would die from plague plus mercury poisoning. Two causes of death, one framework of explanation. The physician would credit disease severity. Historical evidence suggests mercury was so toxic that patients receiving it had worse outcomes than patients receiving nothing. But physicians didn't see this because confirmation bias filtered the evidence. Successful recoveries were noticed and remembered. Deaths were rationalized as inevitable. Arsenic, poison as medicine. Similar logic. Arsenic is poisonous. Therefore it's powerful. Therefore it's medicine. Patients were given arsenic compounds for various conditions. Arsenic causes organ failure and neurological damage. Medieval physicians had no concept of toxicity. They only knew that arsenic was reactive and therefore powerful. A substance that had visible effects must be medically active. Wrong framework produces wrong conclusions. Theriac, the ultimate complex medicine. This was the most famous medicine of the medieval period. It was prescribed for everything. Theriac was a compound, sometimes containing 50-plus ingredients, including viper flesh, opium, saffron, and various herbs. It was expensive. It was complex. It was prestigious. Here's why physicians loved Theriac. It was complicated. The more complicated medicine, the more powerful it seemed. This is backwards reasoning. A simpler treatment is often more effective, but it made psychological sense to medieval physicians. Complex medicine must be more powerful than simple medicine. Theriacs sometimes contain ingredients that had actual medicinal properties. Certain herbs have antimicrobial effects. Opium helps with pain, but also contain ingredients that were inert or harmful. The physicians credited the successes of Theriac while rationalizing the failures as disease severity or patient constitution. Human waste, when confidence meets horror. Yes, really. Feces was prescribed as medicine. The theory, the human body contains specific properties. Human waste comes from the human body. Therefore, human waste contains properties that can treat human bodies. Where would human waste be prescribed? On wounds. On plague buboes, mixed with honey as a poultice. This would introduce bacterial contamination to an open wound. It would accelerate infection. But physicians would observe pus draining from the wound and conclude that the corruption was leaving the body. The treatment was working. In reality, they had opened a door for secondary infection. They were making the condition worse, while interpreting the worsening as evidence of treatment success. This is confirmation bias in its darkest form. Urine, diagnosis and treatment. This was analyzed for diagnosis and prescribed as medicine. A physician would taste a patient's urine and make a diagnosis based on taste, color, and clarity. He would also have patients drink their own urine as treatment. The theory, urine is refined by the body, therefore contains medicinal properties. The reality, urine is waste. Drinking it provides no medical benefit and introduces bacterial contamination, but physicians prescribed it with confidence because it fit the framework. The body produced it, so it must contain body-relevant properties. The logic was internally consistent. The logic was completely wrong. Animal parts. Sympathetic magic is medicine. Physicians would prescribe medicines made from animal organs, animal feces, animal blood. The sympathetic magic theory. If an animal was known for a trait, parts of that animal would transfer that trait. Owls have good night vision, so owl eyes treat eye problems. Lions are strong, so lion fat treats weakness. Birds fly, So bird parts might help someone rise up, treat depression. This is magical thinking. But it was institutional, prestigious, and taught in universities. Medical texts describe specific animal parts for specific conditions. Universities required knowledge of these correspondences. It was legitimate medicine because the institution said it was. Mercury vapor inhalation, neurotoxicity as treatment. For plague, physicians would have patients inhale mercury vapor. The theory, the vapor would penetrate the body and kill the corruption. The reality, mercury vapor is neurotoxic. Patients inhaling mercury would suffer neurological damage. They would experience tremors, confusion, psychological disturbance. Physicians would interpret these symptoms as a treatment working, the corruption being driven out of the body. The patient's neurological damage was reinterpreted as evidence that the medicine was powerful. The framework could incorporate even the poison's harmful effects as evidence of its power. Exotic ingredients, value as medicine. Unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, which was astronomically expensive. Ground emeralds, gold leaf, precious stones. The theory, these valuable substances must have valuable properties. The reality, they're inert, but patients who could afford them were charged enormous amounts of money. A course of unicorn horn treatment could cost more than a laborer's annual wages. A physician could become wealthy by prescribing these substances. There was enormous economic incentive. Here's where it gets dark. Wealthy patients could afford expensive treatments. Wealthy patients were therefore more likely to receive mercury, arsenic, theriac, and unicorn horn. Poor patients received simpler, mostly harmless remedies. Historically, wealthy patients had worse plague outcomes than poor patients. The medicine was killing them, but physicians didn't see this. Why? Because they didn't systematically compare outcomes across patient populations. They treated wealthy patients who paid more, therefore were valued more, and attributed outcomes to disease severity rather than treatment. The wealthy patient who survived was living proof the treatment worked. The wealthy patient who died had simply received treatment too late. The psychology of complex medicine. This is worth understanding in depth because it reveals how confidence in frameworks generates terrible solutions. A physician could give a patient a simple herb remedy. The herb might help or might do nothing. The patient would recover or not recover. Or the physician could give a patient a complex medicine containing 20-plus ingredients, including mercury, theriac, powdered emeralds, and unicorn horn. This medicine would cost a fortune. It would have visible effects. Mercury would cause tremors, nausea. It would be mysterious, and the outcome would still be uncertain. But here's the psychological difference. The complex medicine feels more powerful. It causes visible effects. It's expensive. It's mysterious. It's prestigious. If the patient recovers, the complex medicine gets credit. If the patient dies, the disease was too advanced, and the medicine was the last hope. A simple remedy has no such psychological power. It seems insufficient. If a patient recovers, it seems coincidental. If a patient dies, the remedy was obviously inadequate. This is why medieval physicians would often prescribe the most complex, toxic, expensive medicines they could create. Not because these were more effective, they weren't, but because they had more psychological power. They fit the narrative of serious treatment for serious disease. Let's trace a specific case. A wealthy merchant with plague in 1360s Florence. The physician is called. He arrives with his assistants. He carries his pharmacological arsenal. Theriac, mercury, leeches, powdered emeralds, a medicine made from human waste, and honey. His diagnosis: severe humoral imbalance, excess of hot and wet humors, corruption spreading. His treatment plan: 1. Bleed the patient extensively. 2. Prescribe theriac mixed with wine 3 times daily. 3. Prescribe mercury inhalation therapy. 4. Apply the feces honey poultice to plague buboes. 5. Have the patient drink powdered unicorn horn dissolved in wine. The cost: equivalent to several $1,000s in modern currency. The patient follows this regimen. What happens? If the patient recovers, the physician gets credit. The Theriac worked. The mercury inhalation accelerated healing. The patient's constitution was strong enough to overcome the initial corruption. The expensive, complex, toxic treatments are validated. If the patient dies, the corruption was too advanced when I arrived. The disease progressed too rapidly. No treatment could have saved him. I did everything possible. The physician then moves to the next patient, and the next. And throughout his career, he accumulates successes which are credited to his treatment, and failures which are rationalized through the framework. Here's the genuinely insidious part. Physicians weren't dishonest. They weren't lying to their patients. They believed the treatment worked. They had genuine cases of recovery that they interpreted as evidence. They didn't have a conceptual framework to see that they were engaging in confirmation bias. The system had created a situation where a physician could be intelligent, careful, thoughtful, and still prescribe treatments that harm patients. Because the system itself, the framework, the authority, the institutional structure, prevented him from seeing the harm. Here's the question. If these medicines were toxic, if they were harming patients, why did they persist? Why didn't physicians notice? The answer involves several layers. Selective observation. Physicians notice successes. They rationalize failures. This is confirmation bias, but it's not individual bias. It's systemic. The entire institution reinforced successful interpretation and ignored contradictory evidence. Complexity equals expertise. A simple herb remedy could be given by an herbalist. A complex pharmaceutical with mercury and theriac could only be prescribed by a university-trained physician. This created professional incentive to prefer complex medicines. Complex medicines were also more expensive, which meant higher profit margins for physicians. Expensive equals prestigious. Patients paying enormous sums for treatment believed they were getting valuable medicine. If they recovered, they credited the expensive medicine. If they died, they trusted that the physician had tried everything possible. Expensive medicines created narrative justification for outcomes. Institutional reinforcement. Medical schools taught theriac, mercury, and complex pharmacology. Licensing exams required knowledge of these substances. Professional licensing allowed physicians to charge premium prices for treatments with these medicines. The institution rewarded those who prescribed toxic medicines most confidently. Lack of alternative framework. Medieval physicians had no germ theory. They had no understanding of toxicity. They had no way to think about medicine except through humoral theory. So when faced with the choice between complex medicine that causes visible effects and simple remedy, the complex medicine seemed more logical. Economic incentive. A wealthy patient getting sicker despite mercury treatment still paid the physician. The treatment could be adjusted, more mercury, different timing, additional theriac. The patient's money continued to flow to the physician. The outcome was less important than the treatment being seen as serious and expensive. This is how a catastrophic system perpetuates itself, not through stupidity or malice, but through alignment of incentives, institutional reinforcement, and frameworks that prevent perception of harm. The tragedy is that simple remedies, rest, clean water, good nutrition, would have helped patients more. But these were cheap, simple, and didn't demonstrate expertise. So physicians prescribed complexity and toxicity instead. Underscore. So medicine was theoretically wrong and pharmacologically dangerous. But here's something we haven't discussed. The environment where all this was happening. Medieval homes weren't just uncomfortable. They weren't just unpleasant. They were actively hostile to survival. They were cold, damp, filthy spaces optimized for disease spread. And physicians had to work in these spaces. They had to treat patients in homes where the environment itself was an enemy. So let's ask, what happens when wrong medicine meets catastrophic environment? When a physician tries to help someone in a space that's actively preventing survival, what does medieval medicine look like when filtered through thermodynamic reality? Because once you understand the cold and damp of medieval spaces, you'll understand why medicine didn't just fail, it catastrophically failed. Here's a question that usually gets overlooked. What if the environment was actually worse than the medicine? Think about it. Medieval medicine was theoretically wrong. The treatments were often harmful. But the environment, the physical spaces where medicine happened, was actively catastrophic. And once you understand this, you understand something crucial. Medieval physicians weren't just fighting disease. They were fighting physics. A medieval peasant's home, the place where a physician would arrive to treat plague, was thermodynamically nightmarish. Cold, damp, filthy. The kind of space that's actively hostile to human survival. And when you add a sick person to this space, when you add a weakened immune system, when you add bloodletting and mercury and open wounds, you're not treating disease. You're accelerating death in an environment optimized for death. Here's the critical question. How does a wrong theory perform when implemented in a catastrophically wrong environment? What happens when confident medicine meets thermodynamic reality? The answer requires us to think about something medieval physicians didn't understand. The physics of survival. The actual thermodynamic processes that keep humans alive. Because once you understand that, you understand why medieval medicine failed, not just theoretically, but physically. Let me give you real numbers. Archaeological evidence from medieval dwelling sites like West Stow in Suffolk provide specific measurements. A typical medieval peasant home was roughly 200 to 300 square feet. It had minimal windows. It had a thatched roof that leaked. The walls were wattle and daub, woven branches covered with mud and straw. No insulation in any modern sense. Using basic thermodynamic calculations and R-value analysis, R-value is insulation rating. A modern home might have R20 to R30 insulation. This keeps heat inside. A medieval peasant home had an R-value of roughly 1 to 2. This means heat escaped constantly, rapidly, uncontrollably. Now calculate heat loss. A human at rest in a warm environment maintains body temperature through standard metabolic rate, roughly 100 calories per hour. In a medieval home in winter, let's say 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit inside, a human might be burning 150 to 200 additional calories per hour, just generating heat to stay alive. This isn't theoretical. This is thermodynamic necessity. The human body loses heat through radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. In a cold medieval space, all four mechanisms are working overtime. The result? You need more calories just to survive. You need more food than you have access to. Most medieval people were in chronic caloric deficit, especially in winter. They were constantly hungry. Their bodies were constantly cold. This isn't discomfort. This is malnutrition and stress that weakens every biological system, creating vulnerability to disease that physicians couldn't treat with their theoretical framework. Let's trace what happens when a physician arrives in this environment to treat a plague patient. The physician himself is already compromised. He's traveled in cold. He's been exposed to weather. His core body temperature might be slightly low. His fine motor control is diminished because his body has reduced blood flow to extremities to preserve core temperature. He's hungry. He hasn't eaten a substantial meal in hours. His thinking is slightly compromised by the metabolic stress of cold exposure. He arrives at the patient's home. The home is colder than his body temperature. Smoke hangs in the air from a central fire. There's no chimney, so all smoke vents through holes in the roof, which means heat also vents through those same holes. Constant convective heat loss. The floor is packed earth, damp. The walls are weeping moisture. The smell is overwhelming, a combination of unwashed humans, animal waste, decaying organic material, mold. The dam creates conditions where the body is losing heat not just through radiation and conduction, but through evaporation. Moisture in the air accelerates evaporative cooling. The patient has plague. The patient has fever. The immune system's attempt to fight infection. But the patient is also in a cold environment, so the body is losing heat faster than normal. The patient is experiencing contradictory thermal stresses. Fever wants a raised temperature, but the environment is rapidly cooling the body. The patient is shivering while sweating. The body is in crisis. The physician performs bloodletting. He removes blood. Blood is a heat-carrying fluid. Removing it reduces the body's ability to maintain temperature. He's removing approximately 15% of the patient's blood volume. This creates immediate complications. 1. The patient becomes weaker. 2. The patient's ability to maintain body temperature declines. 3. The patient's metabolic rate drops because the body has less capacity to generate heat. 4. The patient's immune function declines because fighting infection requires metabolic resources that are now insufficient. From a modern perspective, the bloodletting is directly harmful. It's making every problem worse. From a medieval perspective, the bloodletting is treating humoral imbalance. Let me give you the thermodynamic reality. A person with plague in a medieval home needs to maintain elevated metabolic rate to fight the infection and stay warm. Bloodletting reduces metabolic capacity. This is the opposite of what the body needs. The physician applies mercury inhalation therapy. Mercury is neurotoxic. It affects the brain. The patient's temperature regulation center is being poisoned. The patient's ability to respond to temperature stress is compromised. At the same time, the mercury is causing nausea, which reduces appetite, which further worsens a caloric deficit. The physician applies the feces honey poultice to plague buboes. This introduces bacterial contamination to the wound. The body's immune response, already overwhelmed by fighting plague bacteria throughout the body, now has to deal with additional infection at the wound site. More metabolic stress, more caloric burn, less resources available for actual plague response. The patient is in a cold environment. The patient is weak from blood loss. The patient is being poisoned by mercury. The patient has an infected wound. The patient is in caloric deficit. The body's metabolic resources are divided between fighting 3 simultaneous challenges: plague, mercury poisoning, and wound infection, while simultaneously trying to generate heat in a cold environment. This is not medicine. This is accelerated death. But here's what the physician sees. The patient is very sick. Multiple symptoms. The treatment is intensive. The physician is applying all available knowledge. Whatever happens next is beyond medical control. The damp in the environment compounds everything. Water in the air increases heat loss through evaporation. A medieval home in winter would have 80 to 95% humidity. The walls would be damp. The straw on the floor would be wet. The patient's clothing would be damp. All of this accelerates heat loss. Here's a specific calculation. Evaporative heat loss in humid environments can be 2-3x higher than in dry environments. A patient in a damp medieval home is losing heat faster than the same patient would lose heat in a dry environment. The body has to generate more heat just to maintain temperature. More calories burned, more metabolic stress, more depletion of resources needed for immune response. Now let's talk about infection, because that's where the thermodynamic reality gets darkest. A medieval home is filthy. The floor has been accumulating organic matter for months or years. Straw has been replaced periodically, but the accumulated dirt is never fully removed. Animal waste is present. Human waste is present. Mold is growing on the damp walls. This isn't just unpleasant. It's an active infection risk. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of plague, can survive on certain surfaces for weeks. Fleas carrying plague live in filthy environments. The home is optimized for plague spread. A physician arriving carries instruments that have been exposed to air, to dust, to contamination. He touches the patient. He doesn't wash. He visits the next patient. Plague bacteria, or in the case of bloodletting, whatever bacteria are present on his lancet, spread from patient to patient. The physician is a vector for disease spread, not through intention, but through physics. Contaminated instruments, contaminated hands, plague-infected fleas on his clothing. These are mechanisms of transmission. Here's where it gets even darker. The physician is trying to help. He's performing bloodletting to treat disease. But every intervention introduces risk of infection. The open wound from bloodletting is an entry point for bacteria. The body's immune system, already overwhelmed by plague, now has to deal with additional infection from the bloodletting wound. The Theriac and mercury prescribed internally, they have metabolic costs. The body has to metabolize mercury. This requires enzymatic processes, energy expenditure, detoxification. The body's already stressed metabolic system has to handle an additional burden. Let's model what's happening metabolically. Asterisk normal person at rest, 100 calories per hour. Asterisk same person in cold environment, 150 to 200 cal/hour additional. Asterisk same person fighting plague, 200 to 300 cal/hour additional due to fever and immune response. Asterisk same person who's been bloodlet, reduce baseline metabolic capacity, fewer red blood cells to carry oxygen and nutrients. Asterisk same person in damp cold environment, additional evaporative cooling, plus reduced circulation to extremities. Asterisk same person being poisoned by mercury, additional metabolic cost to detoxify, neurological stress. Add these together. A plague patient in a medieval home is burning massive amounts of calories while being in chronic caloric deficit. The body's resources are being divided between multiple competing needs. The immune system is compromised by malnutrition. The thermal regulation system is compromised by cold exposure and mercury poisoning. The likelihood of survival is dropping, not rising. The physician sees a patient getting progressively weaker. From his perspective, the corruption is advancing. The disease is progressing. The body is being overwhelmed. These interpretations are actually describing the patient's thermodynamic collapse, but the physician doesn't have that vocabulary. Here's the key insight. Medieval medicine failed not just because the theory was wrong, but because it was implemented in an environment that was actively lethal. The medicine didn't just fail to help, it made the environment worse. Bloodletting reduces the body's capacity to maintain temperature in a cold space. Mercury poisoning compromises thermoregulation. Open wounds introduce infection in a filthy environment. Everything the physician did was working against the body's ability to survive in medieval conditions. A patient at home, warm, rested, fed, might survive plague better than a patient being treated by a physician in a cold environment while being bled and poisoned. This is a tragic intersection. Wrong theory meets catastrophic environment. The theory creates interventions that make the environment worse. The environment is already hostile. The medicine becomes the final blow. Let's get specific about medieval building thermodynamics, because this is crucial for understanding why medicine failed. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval peasant homes were often partially sunken into the ground. This provided some insulation, but created severe damp problems. Water would seep up from the ground. The interior walls would be constantly weeping moisture. The excavations at West Stowe show evidence of repeated straw replacement. The straw would become sodden and require replacement every few months. The central hearth, the fire in the middle of the space, was the heat source. But here's the thermodynamic problem. The fire consumed oxygen and created carbon monoxide. To prevent poisoning, holes had to be left in the roof. These holes allowed smoke to escape, but they also allowed heat to escape. The temperature differential between the fire and the holes created constant convective heat loss. A physician working near the fire would feel the relative warmth, but move away from the fire, and the temperature would drop rapidly. The space wasn't uniformly heated. It was a gradient, very warm near the fire, increasingly cold away from the fire. The patient with plague would be moved near the fire for warmth, but this exposed him to smoke inhalation, which damages respiratory tissues, important when you're already immunocompromised. And moving near the fire meant being in the same space as the most contaminated air, where smoke, mold spores, and airborne pathogens concentrate. The damp was persistent. Even with a fire burning, the humidity would remain high because the ground beneath the building was constantly seeping moisture. Medieval building techniques didn't include vapor barriers. Water would move freely from ground into the structure. This created an ideal environment for mold growth. Mold thrives in damp spaces with moderate temperature, which is space where fire provides. Aspergillus, a fungal infection, can be acquired by inhaling mold spores. A person with a compromised immune system, which plague accomplishes, would be at high risk for secondary Aspergillus infection. The combination of plague infection plus mold exposure plus mercury poisoning would create multiple simultaneous respiratory and systemic challenges. The patient would die not just from plague, but from complications introduced by the environment and treatment. But the physician wouldn't see it this way. He would see a patient with plague that progressed to fatal complications. He would attribute this to disease progression, not to the combination of infection, environment, treatment, and malnutrition. Here's the question that should haunt us. Could medieval medicine have worked better in a different environment? If a patient could be kept warm, genuinely warm, not just near a fire, but actually maintaining body temperature. If the environment were clean rather than filthy. If the patient could be well-fed rather than caloric deficient. If the patient had access to water without having to carry it through cold. Could medieval medicine have had better outcomes? The answer is probably yes, but not because the medicine worked. It's because the patient's body would have had resources to recover despite the medicine. Bloodletting would still be harmful, but a well-nourished patient might have the reserves to recover anyway. Mercury would still be toxic, but a patient in a warm, clean environment might survive the toxicity. The wounds from bloodletting would still carry infection risk, but in a clean environment, the risk would be lower. The environment was so hostile that even surviving plague was difficult without medical help. Add medical harm, and survival became nearly impossible. The consequence was that wealthy people who lived in better houses, had access to more food, had warm rooms, still died of plague at high rates when they sought physician care. Poor people, who had worse homes, worse nutrition, but less access to physicians, sometimes survived at higher rates, not because of better health, but because they avoided a medicine that would have killed them faster. Understanding medieval medical failure requires understanding that it was a failure of multiple systems simultaneously. Wrong theory, toxic treatment, catastrophic environment, inadequate nutrition, compromised immunity. The medicine wasn't the only problem, but it was the problem that could have been controlled. And it wasn't. The environment was killing people. The medicine was killing people. But what happened when someone needed emergency intervention? What happened when medicine had to actually do something? Surgically intervene, amputate, treat a traumatic injury. Because surgery is where medieval medicine abandoned any pretense of understanding and just started cutting. And the results were nightmarish. Surgical mortality rates that would horrify modern physicians. Techniques that were essentially medieval torture disguised as medicine. Anesthesia that was unreliable and sometimes lethal. Let's talk about what medieval surgery actually was. Not the theory, not the philosophy, the actual practice, the tools, the techniques, the pain, and the mortality rates that physicians somehow rationalized as acceptable. Here's where we shift from medicine to surgery. And here's why this matters. Surgery is where the gap between confidence and competence becomes most obvious. Because surgical interventions are visible, dramatic, and often immediately fatal if they go wrong. A physician can prescribe Theriac and claim credit for recovery. The causation is invisible. But a surgeon amputates a limb. The patient either heals or dies. The outcome is obvious. Yet medieval surgeons continued to perform surgery with catastrophic mortality rates. Why? Not because they were stupid. Because the framework, the same framework that locked medicine in place, also locked surgery in place. A surgeon couldn't question whether amputations were the right approach because the framework said they were. A surgeon couldn't notice that his mortality rates were too high because the framework explained the deaths. Here's the critical question. What happens when you perform invasive procedures using techniques that introduce infection in an environment that's filthy, with pain management that's unreliable, with theoretical understanding of what you're doing that's fundamentally wrong, what happens? You get medieval surgery, and the results speak for themselves. Medieval surgeons inherited a framework from Guy de Chauliac and others. The theory: wounds must be kept open so that corruption can drain. Closing wounds traps corruption inside. Therefore, open wounds are good. Closed wounds are dangerous. This framework sounds logical until you think about infection. Modern medicine knows that wound closure, with proper sterile technique, prevents infection. An open wound in a filthy environment is a wound that will almost certainly become infected. Medieval surgeons didn't have this knowledge. They had the opposite knowledge. Open wounds were therapeutic. Closed wounds were dangerous. So a surgeon would deliberately avoid closing wounds. He would leave them open, apply poultices, hope corruption drained, and expect infection as a normal part of recovery. But here's where the framework becomes epistemically sealed. When infection developed, and it almost always did, the surgeon didn't conclude that the open wound caused infection. He concluded that the corruption was leaving the body, which was exactly what should happen. The framework predicted infection. Infection confirmed the framework. Contradiction was reframed as confirmation. A modern surgeon, seeing a 50% infection rate from amputations, would immediately stop the procedures and investigate. A medieval surgeon, seeing a 50% infection rate, would conclude that the procedures were necessary. Without infection drainage, the mortality would be 100%. The framework provided explanation for the high failure rate. The conditions were severe, not the procedures. Moreover, some surgical patients did recover. A broken bone, properly realigned and immobilized, could heal. When they did, the surgeon took credit. This reinforced the system. Let's describe specific surgical procedures as they were actually performed. Amputation, the nightmare procedure. A patient has a gangrenous leg. The tissue is dead, blackened, putrefied. A medieval surgeon would decide on an amputation. The question: at what point? The surgeon needed to amputate above the line of viable tissue. But viable tissue is determined by blood flow. Without understanding vascular systems, the surgeon had to guess. He would examine the leg, looking for color change. He would try to cut through apparently dead tissue and judge where living tissue began. Often, he would amputate too low, leaving dead tissue that would lead to further amputation, or amputate too high, causing excessive blood loss. Once the amputation point was chosen, the actual procedure began. The surgeon had 3 methods. Method 1. The saw, a surgical saw, was used to cut through the bone. This is crude. The saw damages surrounding tissue. It generates heat from friction. It shatters the bone rather than cleanly separates it. The patient is screaming. There's minimal anesthesia. The assistants are holding him down. Blood is pouring. The saw is pulling, scraping, trying to cut through living bone. This takes 30+ minutes of sustained agony. Method 2. The knife, a large surgical knife, will be used to cut through muscle and bone. The knife would need to be sharp. Medieval metalwork couldn't produce blades as sharp as modern surgical instruments. So the surgeon is sawing through tissue with a dull blade. More trauma, more pain, more heat from friction, more tissue damage. Method 3. Cautery for smaller amputations, or in some cases alongside sawing, a heated iron would be used. The iron would be applied to the amputation site. Tissue would burn. The burning would cauterize blood vessels, reducing bleeding, but would also destroy tissue through burn damage, creating necrotic tissue that would become infected. All 3 methods had one thing in common: extraordinary pain. The patient is conscious. Anesthesia is limited. Opium provides some pain relief, but not enough to eliminate the agony of surgical amputation. Mandrake root causes hallucinations and delirium. Alcohol makes the patient drunk and less resistant. But nothing eliminates the pain. The patient is screaming throughout the procedure. The assistants are holding him down. The surgeon is working as quickly as possible, But speed conflicts with care. If he cuts too fast, he damages more tissue. If he cuts too slowly, the pain is prolonged. There's no good option. Once the amputation was done, bleeding had to be controlled. The surgeon would apply tourniquets, pressure, and cauterization to close blood vessels. But he's working with incomplete knowledge of anatomy. He might miss a major blood vessel. The patient might bleed out. Then came the open wound. Remember, medieval theory said to keep it open. So the stump, the exposed bone, the traumatized muscle, the burned tissue was left open. It was treated with poultices, maybe theriac, maybe feces-honey mixture. No closure. No attempt to seal the wound against infection. The open amputation site, in a filthy medieval environment, would almost certainly become infected. Historical records suggest about 40 to 50% of amputations resulted in death from complications. The patient would develop sepsis from the infected wound. They would die in agony, often days or weeks after the amputation. Wound treatment. A more common surgical procedure than amputation was wound treatment. A patient with a penetrating wound needed the wound cleaned, examined for foreign objects, and treated. Medieval technique. Make the wound bigger if necessary to see inside. Remove visible debris. Look for damaged organs without understanding anatomy well enough to know what damage means. Apply poultices. Leave the wound open. A penetrating abdominal wound, which should be surgically closed quickly in modern medicine, would be examined by a medieval surgeon. The surgeon would open it further, look inside, apply theriac and poultices, and leave it open. The exposed peritoneal cavity would become infected. Peritonitis, infection of the abdominal cavity, would develop. The patient would die in agony. But the surgeon would record this as penetrating abdominal wound, examined, treated appropriately. Patient succumbed to severity of injury. The framework explained the death without questioning the treatment. Bloodletting as surgery. As a surgical procedure, bloodletting involved lancing a vein and allowing blood to drain into a basin. The surgeon had to find the right vein, make an incision that wouldn't damage surrounding tissue, and control the flow of blood. How much blood should be removed? Medical text specified, until the patient faints, or approximately 1 pound. This is roughly 20% of blood volume for an average person. For someone already weakened by disease, this is dangerous. A person with plague getting bloodlet would be weakened further. Their already impaired thermoregulation would be compromised more. Their immune response would be suppressed further. The procedure, intended as treatment, was accelerating death. Surgical instruments. Medieval surgeons had tools. Lancets for bloodletting, scythes for different veins, saws for bone, knives for cutting, cautery irons, probes, specula, instruments to open wounds and look inside. These were crafted by skilled artisans and often beautifully made. They looked professional. They looked like they should accomplish something. But they were crude by modern standards. The blades couldn't be as sharp. The tools couldn't be sterilized. Sterilization as a concept didn't exist. A surgical instrument used on one patient would be wiped and used on the next patient, carrying pathogens from one patient to another. Surgical training. How did surgeons learn? Through apprenticeship. A young man would apprentice with an experienced surgeon. He would watch procedures. He would gradually take on more responsibility. The knowledge was transmitted through demonstration, not through understanding. This had advantages. Skilled surgeons developed intuitive understanding of technique, but it had disadvantages. Wrong techniques were passed down. If a surgeon learned a harmful procedure, he would teach it to his apprentices, who would teach it to theirs. There was no mechanism for updating surgical knowledge. There was no central repository of surgical outcomes. A surgeon developing a new technique couldn't share it widely. An effective innovation might be used by one surgeon and his students, then die when he died. A harmful technique might persist for centuries because it was institutional knowledge. Surgical outcomes. Historical records from medieval hospitals and surgical centers show infection rates of 30 to 50% for major procedures. Infection meant sepsis. Sepsis meant death, usually within days, usually in agony. A modern surgeon would see these outcomes and immediately question procedures. A medieval surgeon saw these outcomes as inevitable complications of severe conditions. The theory explained high mortality. High mortality didn't challenge the theory. Moreover, some surgical patients did recover, and when they did, the surgeon took credit. This reinforced the system. Successes were attributed to surgical skill. Failures were attributed to disease severity. The surgeon's confidence was maintained. One more thing needs to be understood about medieval surgery. Patients were largely conscious for procedures. The anesthesia options were limited. Opium, effective at pain relief but unreliable. Dosage varies. Too much causes death. Patients were given wine mixed with opium and hoped for the best. Mandrake root contains tropane alkaloids, causes hallucinations and delirium. Patients would be confused, resistant, unable to follow instructions, but supposedly less aware of pain. Compression, applying tight compression to a limb before amputation would numb it through pressure. This worked somewhat, but required time. Alcohol, getting the patient drunk. Alcohol is a depressant. It provides some pain relief, but impairs consciousness and judgment. Ice or cold water, numbing the area with cold. This provided some pain relief. Nothing. Many procedures are performed with no anesthesia at all. The patient was held down by assistants while the surgeon worked. The combined effect: a patient having their leg amputated might be given opium and wine, having their limb numbed with ice, being held down by assistants while a surgeon sawed through living bone. They would be in extraordinary pain. They would scream. They might struggle so hard the assistants couldn't hold them. The procedure might take 30-plus minutes. A modern surgeon can complete an amputation in 10 to 15 minutes with modern anesthesia. A medieval surgeon took longer, caused more tissue damage, and the patient was conscious for most of it. The psychological trauma was enormous. Patients who survived amputation often experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and psychological damage. Medieval texts note that some post-amputation patients experienced severe depression or psychological breakdown. The same mechanisms that locked medieval medicine in place locked medieval surgery in place. Selective memory. Surgeons remembered successful cases. They rationalized failures as inevitable complications. Over time, their memory selected for cases that validated their approach. Lack of alternative. What was the alternative to surgery for a gangrenous leg? Let it progress? Amputation was dramatic intervention. It was clearly doing something. Patients might choose amputation over waiting to die slowly from gangrene spreading. The alternative, doing nothing, seemed worse than surgery, doing something, even if surgery had a 50% mortality rate. Professional authority. A surgeon was trained, credentialed, professional. He had authority. When a procedure failed, the authority's explanation was accepted. The corruption was too advanced. The disease was too severe. I did everything possible. Economic incentive. Surgeons made money from surgical procedures. The more surgery, the more income. There was incentive to recommend surgery, to perform it even when outcomes were questionable, to charge high fees for the dramatic intervention. Institutional structure. Surgery became professionalized. Guilds of surgeons formed. Training became standardized. Wrong techniques were institutionalized. Apprentices learned from masters. Masters had been trained by earlier masters. Harmful techniques persisted through institutional transmission. No feedback mechanism. A modern surgeon with high complication rates would be reviewed, questioned, maybe lose his license. A medieval surgeon, with 50% amputation mortality, was seen as doing everything possible in a difficult situation. There was no mechanism to measure outcomes systematically across surgeons or across time. This is the structural reason medieval surgery failed. not because individual surgeons were incompetent, but because the system prevented learning from outcome data. The framework could accommodate any failure. Every failure became evidence of disease severity, not treatment inadequacy. So we've covered the theoretical wrongness, the pharmaceutical toxicity, the environmental disaster, and the surgical catastrophe. But none of this would have persisted without institutional structure. Medieval medicine didn't fail on its own. It was perpetuated by universities, professional licensing, and systems of knowledge transmission that actively prevented change. The question becomes, how does an institution lock knowledge in place? How does authority prevent learning? And what does this tell us about when institutions, any institutions, become obstacles to progress rather than drivers of it? Let's talk about the university system that created medieval medicine and the mechanisms by which it ensured medieval medicine persisted for centuries despite being catastrophically wrong. Here's a question that should disturb you. How does wrong knowledge become institutional knowledge? How does a single wrong-headed theory become so embedded in institutional structures that it persists for centuries, resisting evidence, preventing alternative approaches, and killing people, all while being taught as truth? The answer is institutional lock-in, and it requires understanding something crucial. The medieval university system wasn't designed to discover truth. It was designed to preserve and transmit authority-backed knowledge. These are opposite goals. Medieval universities like Paris, Padua, and Salerno created infrastructure for knowledge transmission, curricula, licensing requirements, professional standards. All of this created stability. But stability isn't the same as truth. An institution can be very good at preserving wrongness if that wrongness is baked into the system. Here's what we need to understand. Medieval medicine didn't persist because physicians were stupid or because the evidence for it was strong. It persisted because the institutional structure made it nearly impossible to change. Because professional success required conformity. Because authority, once established, becomes nearly unquestionable within institutional structures. This is a final piece of understanding medieval medicine. It wasn't a failure of individual intelligence. It was a failure of institutional design. It was a system that prevented learning even when smart people were paying attention. Let's trace the mechanism. It starts with curricula. The University of Paris Medical School, the most prestigious in Europe, required students to study specific texts. Galen's texts, Hippocratic texts, Avicenna. These weren't studied as historical artifacts or one perspective among many. They were studied as truth. The curriculum assumed these ancient authorities were right. The student's job was to understand their writings, not to question them. A student who questioned Galen during his medical education would be corrected. That's not what Galen says. Here's what Galen actually teaches. The student would learn the correct interpretation of Galen, not critical thinking about Galen. Exams tested knowledge of the text. A student had to demonstrate understanding of Galen to pass. He didn't need to show that he could test ideas or think critically. He needed to show he knew what Galen said. Licensing required passing these exams. To practice medicine legally, you had to demonstrate knowledge of the authorities. To demonstrate knowledge of the authorities, you had to pass exams testing textual understanding. To pass those exams, you had to study the authorities. The system was circular and self-reinforcing. A physician who wanted to practice differently, who questioned Galen or tried to develop alternative approaches, couldn't get licensed. He would be considered unqualified, unfit for medical practice. His patients would be told he was untrained. His reputation would suffer. This created a system where professional success required institutional conformity. A physician who wanted to keep his license, maintain his reputation, earn income from his practice, had to teach what he was taught. He had to practice what he was trained to do. Deviation was professionally risky. The institution also created
the liver,
communities
as described in On the
practice.
Natural Faculties,
Physicians
converts
trained
chyle
at the
into
same
blood,
universities,
which is then distributed by the
read the
veins
same
to nourish all
texts,
parts.
followed the same practices. They formed professional organizations. They created standards. These communities reinforced conformity. A physician who practiced differently would be noticed. He would be questioned by colleagues. His deviance would be noted. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine a brilliant medieval physician. He's smart, careful, observant. He's trained at the University of Paris. He's studied Galen. He's passed his licensing exams. He's practicing medicine in a major city. Over years of practice, he accumulates observation. He bleeds patients. Some recover. Some die. He keeps records. He's careful. But he starts to notice something. The patients he bleeds seem to have outcomes similar to patients he didn't bleed, when he didn't have time, or when he forgot, or when the patient refused bloodletting. In fact, and this would be true historically, patients avoiding bloodletting seem to survive better. This is evidence. Real evidence. Our brilliant physician is noticing a pattern. What happens next? Option A. He concludes that bloodletting is harmful. He stops bloodletting. He publishes his findings. Option B. He rationalizes the observation to fit the framework. In the medieval institutional context, Option B is virtually inevitable. Here's why. First, he can't publish findings without institutional support. There's no peer-reviewed journal. He could write a manuscript, but distributing it to colleagues would require traveling or copying by hand. Most physicians never would hear about his manuscript. There's no infrastructure for sharing new findings. Second, if he stops bloodletting and word gets out, his colleagues question his competence. He doesn't bloodlet, he hasn't been properly trained. The University of Paris teaches bloodletting. If he's not bloodletting, he must be practicing substandard medicine. His reputation suffers. Patients avoid him. His income drops. Third, he has to reconcile this observation with everything he believes about medicine. He spent years learning humoral theory. He's taught it to his apprentices. He's built his professional identity on it. To say humoral theory is wrong is to say his entire career has been based on falsehood. Psychologically, this is difficult. Rationally, it's even harder. Fourth, the framework provides ready explanation. Maybe bloodletting works better in some cases than others. Maybe the cases I'm remembering where patients did well without bloodletting had favorable circumstances. Maybe their constitutions were stronger. Maybe I'm selectively remembering. These are all explanations that fit within the framework. They allow him to preserve his worldview without change. So option B is chosen. The physician rationalizes the observation. He continues practicing bloodletting. He teaches it to his students. The institutional system rolls on undisturbed. This is how institutional knowledge prevents learning. Not through active suppression, but through structural incentives and psychological resistance that make change extremely costly. A physician who wanted to change practice would have to 1. Develop an alternative framework, which requires intellectual resources and freedom to think outside constraints. 2. Test it, which requires ability to measure outcomes systematically, unavailable. 3. Publish findings, which requires infrastructure, unavailable. 4. Convince colleagues, which requires that they question their own training and professional identity. 5. Get licensed under new standards, which requires institutional acceptance. 6. Rebuild his reputation, which might take years or never happen. 7. Risk his income and status in the process. These are enormous costs. Set against the possibility of being right, the incentive structure strongly favors conformity. Case study, Andreas Vesalius and anatomical reform. This actually happened in the 16th century, after the medieval period technically, but during the long tail of medieval medicine. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist, began systematically dissecting human cadavers. He compared what he found to Galen's descriptions, and he found errors, significant ones. Galen had described structures that didn't exist in humans. He had described anatomical relationships that were wrong. Vesalius documented these discrepancies carefully. He published a major work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, detailing his findings with beautiful illustrations. What happened next? The medical establishment attacked him. Universities said he was wrong. They said Galen couldn't be wrong. They said Vesalius had dissected unusual cadavers. They said his interpretation was flawed. They mobilized institutional authority against him. Why? Because Vesalius was challenging the foundation of medical knowledge. Medical schools taught anatomy from Galen. If Galen was wrong, then the entire medical curriculum was wrong. Accepting Vesalius's findings meant admitting that centuries of medical education had been based on falsehood. The institutional response was defense. Protect the authority. Protect the system. Resist the challenge. It took decades for Vesalius's findings to be accepted, and this was with printed books, with detailed illustrations, with systematic evidence. During the medieval period, without printing, without institutional mechanisms for distributing new ideas, change was even harder. The problem of textual authority. Medieval medicine was textually transmitted. Knowledge came from books. The most authoritative books were ancient: Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. These authors had lived centuries earlier. They had died. They couldn't be questioned or clarified, but they had written extensively. A medical student reading Galen's works would find detailed explanations. The writing was sophisticated. The logic was clear. If the student didn't understand something, the problem must be with the student, not with Galen. So the student would read more carefully, seek alternative interpretations, try to understand what Galen really meant. This is reverential reading, not critical reading. The assumption is that the text is correct, and your job is to understand a correct interpretation. Medieval universities formalized this. They created commentaries on Galen. Scholars would write interpretations of Galen, trying to clarify his meaning. New commentaries would reference older commentaries. Over time, a massive textual apparatus developed around Galen's original writings. This apparatus served to isolate Galen from challenge. If someone said Galen is wrong, the response would be, "You've misunderstood Galen. Here's the correct interpretation." The original text was never wrong. The reader just hadn't understood it correctly. This created an epistemically sealed system. No matter what evidence contradicted Galen, the system could be preserved by reinterpreting the evidence. The ancient authority was unassailable because any challenge could be framed as misunderstanding. Professional licensing as institutional lock-in. Here's something crucial. Medieval medical licensing required knowledge of the authorities. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate feature of professional organization. Physicians had a guild, a professional organization with standards and enforcement. To join the guild, you had to be licensed. To be licensed, you had to pass an exam. The exam tested knowledge of the canonical texts. Pass the exam, you could practice. Fail, you couldn't. This served a useful purpose. It ensured some minimum standard training, but it also served as institutional lock-in. It made professional success dependent on conformity to the established framework. A physician who wanted to practice differently had to get unlicensed, losing professional standing and income. Unlicensed medicine was seen as illegitimate. Patients were warned against it. Cities had licensing boards that would prosecute unlicensed physicians. The guild system had enforcement mechanisms. So a physician in the medieval world faced a choice: practice within the system and be licensed, respected, paid, or practice outside the system and risk prosecution. The institutional structure created powerful incentives for conformity. The problem of no feedback mechanism. Here's something modern medical institutions have that medieval medicine didn't: outcome data. Modern medicine has electronic medical records. Patient outcomes are recorded. Hospitals track infection rates, mortality rates, complication rates. These can be analyzed. If a procedure has worse outcomes than expected, it's questioned. Medieval medicine had no such mechanism. Physicians kept records, yes, but there was no systematic comparison of outcomes. A surgeon might have a 50% amputation mortality rate, but he wouldn't know whether this was better or worse than other surgeons because he had no way to compare. There was no central registry of outcomes. So a surgeon could have terrible outcomes and never know it. He would compare his cases to cases from historical texts. If historical texts said 50% mortality was normal, then his outcomes were normal. He had no way to know whether a different approach would be better. This is different from the physician thinking he's wrong and rationalizing failure, which also happened. This is a physician who genuinely doesn't know his outcomes are bad because there's no mechanism to measure and compare. Without outcome feedback, there's no pressure to change. A system can persist indefinitely, not because it's working, but because there's no evidence that it's not working or the evidence isn't collected, organized, or shared. Why institutional change is harder than individual learning. Here's the key distinction. An individual can learn. A person can revise their beliefs when presented with evidence. But an institution resists change because changing would require many individuals to simultaneously revise their training, their practices, their professional identity. A physician who realizes bloodletting doesn't work can change. But if his colleagues continue bloodletting, he looks deviant. If the universities still teach bloodletting, he's untrained. If the licensing exams still test bloodletting knowledge, he can't get licensed. Individual learning is blocked by institutional structure. For institutional change to happen, you need either 1. Multiple individuals changing simultaneously, coordination problem. 2. New entrants bringing different training, requires alternative institution. 3. External pressure so strong that resistance becomes untenable. 4. Authority figure endorsing change, requires authority willing to question itself. Medieval medicine had none of these. There was one institutional framework. There were no alternative medical institutions teaching different approaches. Authority figures were invested in the existing system. And coordinating multiple physicians to simultaneously abandon Galen was impossible without communication infrastructure. Let's look at specific mechanisms that kept medieval medicine from evolving. Mechanism 1. Reverential textualism. Texts weren't questioned. They were interpreted. This makes the text unfalsifiable. Any contradiction can be framed as misinterpretation. The text is preserved. The reader is corrected. Truth becomes textual conformity, not empirical accuracy. Mechanism 2. Professional conformity. Incentives deviating from institutional practice risk professional standing. Conformity was rewarded with licensing, respect, income. These incentives were powerful and operated continuously. Mechanism 3. Psychological resistance. Accepting that foundational training was wrong is psychologically difficult. It's easier to rationalize than to restructure. The human mind resists this kind of revision at a deep level. Mechanism 4. Absence of alternative frameworks. You can't think outside a framework if you have no vocabulary for an alternative framework. Medieval physicians couldn't think, maybe invisible organisms cause disease, because the concept of invisible organisms didn't exist in their conceptual vocabulary. The framework wasn't just wrong, it was totalizing. Mechanism 5. Institutional authority as epistemic authority that was institutional, derived from universities, from licensing boards, from established texts, was nearly unquestionable. An individual physician might have doubts, but the institution said the framework was correct. Who was the individual physician to question the institution? Mechanism 6. Selective memory and confirmation bias. At institutional scale, this wasn't just individual cognitive bias. The institution created systems for recording and transmitting knowledge. These systems selected for confirming cases. Successful cases were documented and circulated. Failures were rationalized. The institution's memory was biased by design. Here's the deep lesson. Institutions are good at preserving knowledge, but bad at updating it. A medieval university was excellent at taking knowledge from one generation and transmitting it to the next. Medical students learned what their teachers learned. Teachers learned what their teachers learned. Knowledge was preserved. Stability was achieved. But this same mechanism prevented change. Because the knowledge being preserved was wrong, and the mechanism preserved wrongness as reliably as it would preserve correctness. The institution created what we might call epistemic inertia. Without active mechanisms for challenging and updating knowledge, the institution simply continued. The machinery of education, licensing, and professional practice rolled on. New physicians were trained. They trained apprentices. The apprentices trained others. The wrong knowledge propagated through institutional transmission. From inside the institution, this looked like success. The system was working. Knowledge was being preserved and transmitted. Professional standards were being maintained. The machinery functioned smoothly. The catastrophic harm, the millions dying from plague, the patients killed by mercury, the surgical mortality rates, wasn't visible to the institution as a reason to change. It was visible as evidence that disease was severe. The institution's self-assessment was, we're doing everything possible. The disease is just too strong. The institution couldn't see its own failure because failure was explained by the institution itself. This is what happens when institutional authority becomes more important than evidence, when professional prestige depends on conformity, when the system contains explanation for its failures. The institution becomes an obstacle to learning, not a vehicle for it. Medieval medicine persisted for centuries not because it was right, but because the institutional structure made it nearly impossible to be wrong in any way that would be recognized as wrongness by the institution itself. So, let's assemble what we've learned across 5 hours of deep analysis. Medieval medicine was wrong. Not wrong in one way. Wrong in every possible way. Theoretically, humoral theory misunderstood disease. Pharmacologically, mercury and arsenic as treatment. Environmentally, cold and damp workspaces hostile to survival. Surgically, open wounds and filthy environments. And institutionally, frameworks that prevented learning. But here's what matters. Medieval physicians didn't see themselves as wrong. They saw themselves as doing the best they could within the limits of their knowledge. And from inside their framework, they were applying theory consistently. They were refining technique. They were passing knowledge to students. From the perspective of someone inside the medieval medical system, everything looked reasonable. This is the crucial insight. It's not about medieval medicine specifically. It's about how systems of authority, any systems of authority, can become locked into wrongness while remaining invisible about that wrongness. Here's the mechanism. You take a foundational belief, humors cause disease. You build everything on top of it, treatments to balance humors. You create institutions that transmit this knowledge, universities. You create professional incentives for conformity licensing. You create frameworks that explain failure. The disease was too advanced. You isolate yourself from alternatives. No other framework available. You prevent learning. Institutions don't update. The result, a system that's wrong, confident, institutionally backed, and unable to recognize its own failure. And the tragedy is that medieval physicians were trapped in this system. They weren't bad people. They weren't stupid. They were intelligent people operating within a system that prevented them from seeing the obvious truth that bloodletting was killing patients. The system itself prevented learning. Now here's why this matters. We should be deeply uncomfortable about whether our own systems might be doing this right now. Modern medicine is vastly better than medieval medicine. We understand infection. We have antibiotics. We have evidence-based practice. But we should ask ourselves, are there areas where we're equally confident and equally wrong? Are there frameworks in our institutions where authority has become more important than evidence? Are there ways that our professional incentive structures are selecting for conformity rather than learning? I don't know the answers. Maybe modern medicine has solved this problem. Maybe we built institutions that actually learn from failure rather than rationalizing it. But historically, the pattern has been that each generation thinks they've solved it, and later generations discover they haven't. The medieval physician who prescribed mercury was confident he was helping. He was wrong, but he couldn't see he was wrong because the system made wrongness invisible. I hope modern medicine is different, but I think we should be vigilant about mechanisms that could create the same kind of epistemic closure. Here's what medieval medicine teaches us about human systems. First, confidence is not evidence. A system can be confident and wrong. Confidence plus authority plus institutional backing can make wrongness virtually unshakable. Second, mechanisms matter. A system's ability to learn depends on its design. Medieval medicine was designed to preserve and transmit knowledge, not to challenge and update it. The design prevented learning. Third, frameworks shape perception. A medieval physician couldn't see that bloodletting was harmful because the framework told him it wasn't. The framework filtered evidence. Alternative evidence didn't register as contradiction. It was reinterpreted to fit the framework. Fourth, institutional incentives are powerful. Professional success required conformity. Individual physicians who might have noticed something was wrong couldn't change practice without risking reputation and income. Fifth, failure explanation kills learning. When a system contains built-in explanations for failure, failure can't teach. A framework that says failure means a disease was too advanced can't be challenged by failure. 6. Authority becomes epistemically isolated. Once an authority like Galen is established, challenging the authority means challenging the entire institution. This is costly. Most people won't do it. What's genuinely tragic about medieval medicine is not the suffering. History is full of suffering. It's the fact that the suffering was preventable. A medieval physician who stopped bloodletting might have better outcomes. A medieval physician who worked in clean environments might have better outcomes. A medieval physician who questioned the framework might have made discoveries. But the system prevented this, not through conspiracy, through structure, through design, through the way institutions work. And medieval people, patients mostly, but also physicians, were trapped in this system. They had limited choices. They did what they could with what they understood. Here's what I want you to sit with. Maybe we're trapped in systems like this too. Maybe we're confident about things that are wrong. Maybe our institutions are designed in ways that prevent us from seeing obvious truths. Maybe future generations will look back at us and ask, how were they so confident about something so obviously wrong? Medieval physicians couldn't see it. Can we? The real lesson of medieval medicine isn't, wow, look how stupid they were. It's, wow, look how powerful institutional systems are at perpetuating wrongness. I wonder if we're trapped in similar systems right now. That's uncomfortable, but that's the point. History's job is to make us uncomfortable about ourselves. Thanks for spending this time with me. We've gone from the theory that locked medieval medicine in place, through the toxicity, the environmental catastrophe, the surgical nightmare, and the institutional mechanisms that prevented change. We've traced how an entire profession could be systematically wrong while believing it was right. If this video hit you, if the analysis was valuable, if the deconstruction of institutional failure taught you something about how systems work, like and subscribe. Drop a comment. What modern systems do you think might be locked into wrongness the way medieval medicine was? What confident beliefs might we be wrong about? What institutional incentives might be preventing us from seeing obvious truths? Because the real lesson of medieval medicine isn't about the past. It's a warning about the present. Fade to black.